What if I told you that your moral compass isn't really a guiding star, that it's actually more like a wagging tail? In this explainer, we're going to dig into the really complex and honestly surprising nature of moral reasoning and see how it shapes our decisions in ways we might not even realize. So here's our game plan. First, we'll look at how our own individual reasoning can sometimes, lead us astray. Then, we'll see how a truly brilliant mind like Thomas Jefferson could use reason to justify something completely unjustifiable. But don't worry, it's not all bad news. We're also going to explore the hidden power of arguing things out and how that can help us get to the truth together. And finally, we'll see how that power can scale up to convince an entire country to change its mind on a huge moral issue. All right, let's kick things off with a pretty surprising case study. It reveals how our reasoning can be swayed by something as ridiculously simple as a snack break. Okay, take a look at this chart. It shows the parole grant rates of Israeli judges during the day, and you can see these huge swings. At 10 in the morning, the rate is a pretty hopeful 65%. But just a couple hours later, boom, it plummets to almost zero. Then, right after lunch, it shoots back up to over 60%, only to fall again as the afternoon drags on. I mean, what could possibly explain this roller coaster of justice? Now, you might be thinking, well, it has to do with the kind of crime, right? Or maybe the length of the sentence. But the data shows absolutely no link. So, what's the hidden factor that's really driving these decisions that literally change people's lives? The answer, and you're not going to believe this, is snack time. Yep, the judges were way more lenient right after their 10 a.m. snack and their 1 p.m. lunch. As their energy dropped, so did the prisoners' chances of freedom. And the most shocking part? The judges never, not once, mentioned getting tired as a reason for their decisions. They had no idea how their physical state was messing with their moral judgments. And this is a perfect example of what psychologist Jonathan Haidt calls the emotional dog and its rational tail. So imagine your moral judgments are like a dog. They run around making these quick, instinctive decisions based on gut feelings. Your reason? That's the tail. And the tail doesn't wag the dog, right? It just wags afterward, coming up with all these fancy-sounding explanations for why the dog did what it did. Our reason is basically a post hoc justification machine designed to make our gut feelings look like super well-reasoned conclusions. There was this one really clever study where participants were given a choice between watching two different comedies. But here's the catch. Each screen was next to a different person, and one of them had a visible disability. Overwhelmingly, people just made up a preference for whichever movie let them avoid sitting next to the person with a disability. Their so-called reasoning was just a cover story for their own unconscious bias. It's kind of like when someone says they're on social media for the news. But come on, they're probably just there for the memes and the drama. We're all masters of self-deception, constantly inventing reasons to justify what we want to do. In another study, men who wanted to look at a swimsuit issue would suddenly decide that sports coverage or feature articles were the most important factor in choosing a magazine, all depending on which justification best served their real purpose. So, if this is how our minds work with these small, everyday decisions, what happens when the stakes are way, way higher? Let's take a look at the case of Thomas Jefferson, a man whose brilliant mind was used not to find truth, but to justify a massive injustice. Thomas Jefferson, the man who wrote that all men are created equal, he was a huge champion of Enlightenment ideals. He fought for things like universal education and against cruel punishment. I mean, his words inspired a revolution and laid the groundwork for a new nation. But at his home, Monticello, there was this dark, terrible secret hiding in plain sight. This champion of liberty was also the master of nearly 200 enslaved people. People who were bought and sold like cattle, whipped into submission, and torn from their families just to pay for his lavish lifestyle. And this is where we see the really dark side of that rational tale. To somehow square his noble ideals with his brutal reality, Jefferson's brilliant mind cooked up some of the most grotesque rationalizations in history. He argued that Black people were physically and morally inferior, that their love was nothing more than an eager desire, and that their griefs were transient. He was using his incredible powers of reason, not to find the truth, but to build a fortress of lies around his own hypocrisy. In the end, reason wasn't Jefferson's guide to enlightenment at all. It was his accomplice in self-deception. It allowed him to keep his slaves, keep his wealth, and somehow keep a clean conscience. And tragically, his rationalizations didn't die with him. They actually became the intellectual foundation for a century of racist pseudoscience, poisoning American society for generations. Okay, so if our own reason is so easily hijacked by our biases and our desires, is it just completely useless when it comes to changing other people's minds? Are we all just a bunch of dogs barking at each other with our rational tails wagging in the wind?
Well, Jonathan Haidt put this to the test with a pretty famous thought experiment. He told people a story about a brother and sister who, just once, make love. They use two forms of contraception, nobody gets hurt, and they both feel like it actually brings them closer. So the question is what they did wrong? Almost everybody says yes, absolutely. But here's where it gets weird. When the experimenter presses them for a reason, and then one by one debunks every justification they can think of, they don't change their minds. They just say, I don't know, I can't explain it, I just know it's wrong. They're literally left with a moral judgment that has no rational leg to stand on.
Now, this might seem totally irrational, but there's a certain kind of logic to it. See, according to the interactionist approach to reason, we're not always trying to figure everything out for ourselves. A lot of the time, we're just outsourcing our thinking to experts we trust. You might not be able to explain the science behind vaccines, for example, but you trust your doctor, and you trust that they know what they're talking about. So when people stubbornly cling to their beliefs, it's not always because they're being irrational. A lot of the time, it's just because they're putting their faith in a different set of experts.
But what if we're not just trying to defend our own side's experts? What if we're actually genuinely trying to find the right answer together? This is where reason's true power really starts to show up. The psychologist Jean Piaget discovered this with a really simple experiment with kids. He told them two stories. In the first one, a boy named John is trying to be helpful and come to dinner, but he accidentally trips and breaks 6 cups. In the second story, a boy named David is trying to be naughty and steal some cookies, but he only ends up breaking 1 cup. Piaget then asked the kids a simple question: who is naughtier? At first, a lot of the younger kids got it wrong. They said John was naughtier because he broke more cups. They were totally focused on the outcome, not the intention. But then, Piaget did something brilliant. He put the children in pairs and just had them discuss the problem with each other. And what he found was remarkable. After talking it over, the kids were 5 times more likely to agree that David, the boy with the bad intentions, was the naughtier one. Just by arguing it out, their moral reasoning became more sophisticated, more accurate, and more mature. That's a really powerful demonstration of how group reasoning can lead us to a better understanding of what's right and wrong. And this principle doesn't just apply to kids in broken cups. It can scale up to change the entire course of history. The abolition of the British slave trade is a perfect example. Back then, abolishing the slave trade was a radical, almost unthinkable idea. The pro-slavery lobby was incredibly powerful, and they had a whole arsenal of arguments. They claimed the slaves were treated well, that abolition would destroy the economy, and that it would mess up the supply of sugar and rum. But the abolitionists didn't just appeal to emotion. They fought fire with fire. They gathered mountains of evidence to expose just how brutal the slave trade really was. They pointed out the glaring hypocrisy of a Christian nation doing something so barbaric. And they cleverly used the slavers' own economic logic against them, showing how a free labor system would actually be more prosperous in the long run. Now, this was not a quick or easy victory. It was a decades-long war, fought in Parliament, in the newspapers, and in the hearts and minds of the British people. It started in the 1780s with a small group of Quakers who just dared to challenge the moral consensus. Then, a man named Thomas Clarkson dedicated his life to gathering evidence, creating a mountain of facts that people just couldn't ignore anymore. Finally, a politician named William Wilberforce took that evidence and used it to hammer away at the pro-slavery arguments year after year until he finally broke through. And in 1807, after a long, hard struggle, Parliament voted to abolish the slave trade. So we're left with this fascinating paradox. Reason, it seems, has 2 very different faces. It can be a tool for self-deception, but it can also be a powerful tool for collective enlightenment. You see, when we use reason on our own, we're often just acting like a lawyer, building a case for our pre-existing beliefs. But when we use reason with other people, we can become more like a judge, carefully weighing the evidence and searching for the truth. This is why dialogue, debate, and just being open-minded are so incredibly crucial for a healthy society. They are the engines of moral progress. So the next time you find yourself in a disagreement, don't just try to win. Try to learn something, because it's only by really listening to each other that we can hope to overcome our own biases and maybe together build a more just and compassionate world.